in Tampa, an arts exchange in St. Petersburg, Florida, and has been included in numerous group exhibitions, including Show Me Yours at Monique Meloche in 2019. The current exhibition, Don't Forget to Pack a Lunch, is his first solo exhibition with Monique Meloche. Danny Dunson is an art historian, art advisor, curator, writer, and the founder and owner of Legacy Brothers, an artist development consultancy that prepares emerging and underrepresented artists to transition within the contemporary art market. In 2020, he initiated the Legacy Brothers Artist Residency, which grants critical mentorship and financial endowments to the developing practices of artists in Brazil, Haiti, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Senegal, and the United States. Responding to economic needs of Black arts community members that escalated during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, Dunson also started the Legacy Brothers Book Fund, providing brand new art books for marginalized community members. First, Jake will take us through a slideshow of the paintings and installation views of the current exhibition, and then Jake and Danny will further discuss the ideas presented in the work. Please ask any questions in the chat, and we will give the speakers an opportunity to answer them towards the end. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, Danny. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you. All right. So we're going to walk through the slides together, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. And just in case you don't remember, the name of this solo show is Don't Forget to Pack a Lunch. And we're actually seated in front of the title work of that image, we'll come back to that image later. But let's go ahead and go through the slideshow. Yeah, tell us about basically when someone comes into the gallery and they see all of these images of this guy, this dude just shows up on all of these canvases throughout the gallery. And they happen to all look alike because they are all your self-portrait. So you have inserted yourself within your own work. And the first viewing room is your portraiture that is smaller in scale and only basically containing closer ranged views of the body and the face and different images and poses and expressions. Tell us about what we see in this first room and why is it so important that you insert your own identity in your work?
Yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of my own image or my own form as this kind of elastic. I think of it as an elastic avatar. This figure that I can manipulate and stretch and contort and pose in my compositions. And when I was considering laying out the show, I wanted to separate the large works and the small works. And I think there's this kind of play between the two different rooms of the gallery where the smaller works are I think, they just have this one-to-one relationship with the viewer that I think is really important and interesting.
Right.
There's this immediate subject, and obviously as the viewer, you become this like spectator, and you kind of are having this just one-to-one relationship that changes as you move into the second room. But I wanted to start my viewers off with the smaller, more intimate self-portraits.
Yeah, and they're hung at eye level for the average height of adults. You're basically confronted with the subject, which is also the artist in this point, and this case. And as you look into these, you view these images. It's a confrontation almost, as well as an engagement. It's someplace in between, is it okay to look at this person, as well as an invitation to look at this person? So with that, I would like to ask the question on the more confrontational side, where it may not be okay to gaze at this subject. What are you resisting, or what are your subject matters resisting in these works? And then on the invitation side, what are you beckoning us to take a look at, the viewer? What are you inviting us, giving us access to?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's this idea of voyeurism that's present in all of my work, and I'm interested in that relationship, the kind of the dynamic between the spectacle and the audience. And so I do want there to be this this complexity in that relationship. It's not one or the other. There is this kind of exposure, but then there's also this kind of willingness to be exposed. And I think that for me is important, and not just in these smaller self-portraits, but in the larger work too.
I think that's important to your entire practice. So you just mentioned something, the exposure, as well as the willingness or the intention to be exposed. And you're talking about this tension that you're very comfortable with. I think that might come from your own personal experiences of just sitting somewhere in the middle and never being able to be this binary that is so comfortable for us in society to put into a certain designation. So your works also sit in that non-binary space as well, in the sense that there is this tension that your works are very comfortable with, but the viewer may not be as comfortable, but you lure us in with your palette and the way the images are rendered in this incredibly inviting way that is sumptuous, rich, layered, and bright and vibrant, and with opposing colors at times, and just has a very sunny, bright disposition. Even when it's a serious subject matter, there's something theatrical, which we'll talk about, but also maybe whimsical and somewhat comical, like a satire. So with that, I'm interested in that, inviting someone to gaze. Like, we're in a society where social media is king, and we can think of Andy Warhol, who said that famous quote, that everyone will have their 15 minutes of fame. This idea of choosing celebrity and putting it on yourself. You want the paparazzi, but you really don't, but you invite it. Let's talk about that a little bit, and how you're exploring those themes throughout your practice, and particularly within the show.
I mean, when you talk about like the palette and the way that the images are so graphic, when I think back on like earliest influences, and we've talked about this before, I got this subscription. My mom got me this subscription to Mad Magazine. I was like maybe 8 or 9 or something, and I remember just being struck by this, the graphic, immediate comic palette that was used to, in and I think a really subversive way, because what Mad Magazine was exploring was not lighthearted. Right?
No, not at all.
They were getting deep, and
yeah,
I like that method of giving the viewer some access that feels really seductive immediately. When you see the image, they're very, bright and bold. And I think that again creates this complex relationship with the subject matter, because you're brought in with this sort of, the immediate response is so illustrative. It's so beautiful and smooth. And then as you kind of get into the work and you have to kind of re-examine what it is you're looking at, I think that really creates something that's interesting.
And I think that's really interesting as well. And we can take it apart a little bit when you're speaking of this elastic or elastine avatar. And I think of Mad Magazine, there's this character, this male figure, this young, boyish, youthful looking character that shows up all throughout the magazine, and I believe on every cover. And you see it so much that it kind of becomes, you desensitized. The character is a little jarring. It's not quite, it's not very inviting, super attractive in a traditional sense. It's not very charming, but because we see it so often in so many different ways, it kind of, it desensitizes any alarm towards something that looks sometimes like a puppet or something disturbing, which we'll get to that puppetry in a bit. But I think with your own self, you are, how tall are you?
I'm 6'9".
You're 6'9". And I didn't know how tall he is. I just like to remind myself of how short I am at 6'1". But, you're a very tall person. You're also someone that I know for myself, when I share an image of you, everyone's like, well, who's that standing next to you? They skip over me. And I'm like, okay, great. And so you're an attractive, tall, but you also, with being 6'9" and being tall, there's this sense of feeling outside and feeling awkward, as though people find that attractive. There's also this idea of feeling, this pejorative freak of nature because you're so tall. And there's something about the way you render yourself that gets rid of that activation in your paintings. You offer this incredibly friendly, accessible, smoothed out avatar that is so inviting. It's so attractive in a very charming way. It's also, you are a man of color. You're a Black man. You are a man of color that's intense and how things are perceived. Today, you're showing us your tattoos. We talked about it. All of these things, but when someone sees you, they can make all of these summations and come to these conclusions. But here, you've kind of, in a sense, deactivated, or not deactivated, but released the charge and desensitized all of those things in this neutrality. How does that make you feel personally, that you almost dilute some of the potency of who you are to make it palpable for every viewer? What does that say, not about you, but about the viewership of society?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that I think about a lot, especially when you're considering the Black male form and the Black male figure, and there's a kind of a pushback against that immediate response that some people have. And I think, I don't know, I've always thought about the nudity in my work as kind of working in that same idea. It's like there's this simultaneous, again, hyper vulnerability, but also this like so strange empowerment that comes from the form itself being completely exposed. And I don't know, I'm interested in the subjects, this idea that the subject is, although it's kind of free and it's sitting and it's commanding its own space, it's also at the mercy of its viewer. And for me, I think that's a theme that I'm exploring and kind of working out as the paintings develop, because it's something that I'm only 30 years old. Like, this is something that I have to continue to reconcile with,
Yeah.
So for me, I think sometimes in the studio, we're working through things that we're feeling in real time. And it's definitely something that's always at the forefront of my mind.
Yeah. And it's something that I think your practice comes from your own experiential existence, and they're in dialogue. There's no separation from the art in you, which is actually something I love about you and I love about your art. And I do think the idea of an avatar is something that goes throughout the entire body of work, and as well as your practice. And it's important when we think about things like nudity and we think about the self-portrait, and then this idea of avatar, this kind of desensitizing of what I consider a real personal charge of a personality or of a face or a body. And I think some of those original avatars, so to speak, were even things like Greek sculptures. So they don't represent like people. There's this deity involved. There's this godlike image, and their nudity isn't sexualized. It's almost this untouchable place. They're on this pedestal almost, and it's either aspirational or a guiding force of morality or whatever the case may be, and even aspirational in the way that it's rendered for artists who go and look at these ancient works of antiquity. And I think your work actually operates that way, that even though these are yourself and they are very contemporary images with contemporary hairstyles, things that are culturally charged and things that are very readily recognized as a certain thing, there's something about the way you have rendered the work that takes it outside of the accessibility of humans. So anything that may have been said about you, or any type of dismissal or any type of quick conclusion or sum up with first glance, you can't do that with these images. It takes it outside of that into this kind of other realm. And I find that fascinating. Even though these are realistically, in a sense, have a kind of naturalism, but they're hyper colorized, composed with the expressions. There's melodrama, another Greek and Roman attribute, and that gets us into talking about theater. And that was a really good segue.
Good segue.
That talks about theater, and I think even with this image here, with you peering out of the bushes or out of the foliage, and I just love that series of work which you use as a motif that repeats itself in bodies of work, and you probably will continue with that idea of coming through something. People are viewing you, but you're viewing out, and I think that has a lot to do with this idea of a audience and a star, and how those are both interdependent on each other. You can't have a star without an audience, and an audience is not an audience without a performer, without a star. So I think that's really great to talk about theories of performance, and particularly with this one small work, it's Deposition in Burberry, which I've told you 1,000 times is my favorite, hoping that somehow it would become mine just miraculously. But it is really an amazing work. And I think this one's really important when we talk about performance. And if you can kind of guide us through your thoughts of performance and what we see here with this Deposition in Burberry.
Yeah, as just kind of like an anecdotal thing, my mom was in theater growing up, like doing community theater. And so I was around that a lot. And one of the things that I became fascinated with was this idea of like shitty set design, or like bad set design, and how much it takes for something to be convincing. And that scale is an idea that I play with in my work. If you look at some of the smaller paintings, and there are these backdrops that are sort of rendered in a much more classical way as compared to the larger works that have these flattened spaces and this sort of this illusion of depth and the idea of the spotlight. I am considering the idea of the backdrop and of this sort of like idyllic space in front of which the characters are posed, sort of playing the part that they're playing in each composition. And it just becomes, when I start to think about the subject as performer, and then you start to think about materialism as costume, and then everything that goes into creating this moment that we have all this access to as the viewer. It's I just think that there's so much potential when you start to consider the human being as constantly performing based on environment or based on the situation as a means of self-preservation and adaptation. I mean, code switching is such an interesting idea. And one of the things that I think about so much is the relationship between theory and lived experience. Like I learned what code switching was in grad school, and a white dude taught me that word, but I had been doing it all my life, of course.
Yeah.
So in hindsight, it becomes this really interesting concept that's so natural for me, but also functions as theory. Right.
And it can be studied and thought about outside of you.
Right.
And theorized and in this kind of academic way, or this anthropological way almost, and diagnosing the situation. This is what you're doing, which is problematic at best. But and I was talking to you earlier about, I'm fascinated by the performance mechanisms in your work, but you said something really interesting with the image even that's showing here, which we'll spend a little bit of time on, with the idea of flatness, and also you aren't rendering the other works in this flatness. They're three-dimensional. They're using perspective and academic classicism way, a classical way of painting. So it's almost like you're in conversation with traditional classicism as well as modernist projects. So except you're doing it in this rhetorical way where you're literally saying flat. So you show cutouts of a scene.
Right.
They're still rendered in a three-dimensional way, but you're showing us that it's a flat prop. So this idea of illusion And which is what that struggle was between, are we going to make illusory works? Are we going to make something look like it's truly in the real world using perspective? Or are we going to flatten it out and abstract the shape and say that's real expression? We're not trying to make a painting look like the real world. We want the painting to be a painting. So your work is self-referential, not necessarily in the fact of the paint on the canvas, but the subject matter reference itself. So you're showing a prop on a scene or a staged performance, unlike a Renaissance painting like, I don't know, so many different, like the Sabon women or some of those classical images. They're staged and they're propped and there's a highlight.
Right.
You've erased all of that lustrous, good prop making and you've replaced it with, to use your term, the shitty ones. And they're there in the kind of skyline and these flat images. Yet we have these three-dimensional bodies, and these things are all in concert and conversation together. So it's almost like the past and the present. No matter what we do within art, even though we try to get rid of the idea of illusion is still there. Especially if you're trying to, even in a performance, render yourself as empathetic, caring, but at the same time holding on to a system or buying into a system that does not promote that type of empathy for a human being. So with the Burberry deposition and Burberry, that kind of figure with the scarf. Tell us a little bit about that. Hopefully we can go back to that slide. We didn't get to talking about specifically what that image is. I think that's really important. We move out of this space of performance.
Yeah, I was with that piece specifically, and I think this is why that one was placed kind of on its own. It's a different work, and for me, I also agree with you. I really love the way that it came out. But I was talking about earlier, I referenced earlier. I have this really complicated relationship with consumerism, and I'm really. And I think, I think about duality a lot in my work, but I'm fascinated with and in love with objects, material goods. And I think that there's this, I don't know, maybe it becomes this idea of like upward mobility or like taking something to get close to something else. But with like the polo and the Burberry and this sort of using these things as costume to achieve maybe a sense of status. With that painting specifically, I was thinking about this Burberry shawl that I could never afford, but considering it and like wanting to wrap myself in it. But also, there's the reference to the deposition and this moment. I was looking at Roger van der Weyden when I was composing that piece, and the faces on those figures for me has always been really fascinating, and this grail of painting, but there's also this strangeness to it.
Yes.
And these figures in their expression are just so, there's this oddity that I think is really important when you start to consider the idea of staging and the idea of performative grief and performative expression in general and emotion. So with that piece specifically, there was this like culmination of all of those ideas in this moment. And and
it just shows up but in this very contemporary way that we can really see is adjacent to our situations now. When we think of different types of characters that have become archetypes of, personalities, especially when we think of things within, police violence against Black people and a kind of opting out of a certain personal responsibility or collective responsibility for those who are non-Black. And also there are many who are opting in. And then there's the space in between, this performance space, which I really think this is looking at.
I consider this a lot. There's another piece in this show that I think is, pretty clearly diving into this idea of like performative activism and, what that means, like what it means to be I mean, sometimes we have to wonder how much of a difference there even really is between actual tears and this sort of performative grief. Like, how do we know?
Right.
We talk about Instagram, we talk about all these platforms in which imagery and ideas are so quickly transmitted. I just think that there's something to be said about this line being blurred between the two things.
Absolutely. I think that's really important. And that's a major theme through all of your work, especially one of my favorite ones, which we're able to see behind us, where there's the coffin scene. And there's all of these white men looking at this person of color, this black male, this brown body, and they're all mourning in a very theatrical way, but one has their eye open and like looking to see, and that raises so many questions.
I think of these figures as competitive mourners. they're all grieving or doing what we see as grieving, but they're checking in just to make sure that they're crying as hard as the next figure, kind of to the point where their grief or their competition of grief becomes more important even than the figure that's in front of them, in terms of what it is that they're doing. And yeah, I mean, these figures, I'm with my practice, I've started to kind of bring in these other characters that can represent, I think, fragmentations of the self, but also can represent these external entities. And so, yeah, these pink guys are pretty dark for me.
Yeah, they are. It's a jarring but still welcoming image. Like, I'm so attracted to it. It pulls you in. You can't help but to walk closer to it and look for a while. There's a sense of comedy. Even the faces look like the comedy and tragedy mask,
right.
With this overdone expression that you can't tell if it's a laugh or a mournful expression of pain, and we don't know. And then there's you, which is really another great segue. You being very, peaceful and just kind of suited up in this, this purple suit, but this incredibly calm face that looks even more intentionally calm than a dead person could ever be. So there's like this energy of this exertion of calmness, which means perhaps you're alive as well, performing death for this group of people because perhaps that's what they want to see. And or perhaps it's like a way of playing possum until they leave, and then you can up and be yourself again, which is what I'm thinking of a segue, talking about identity, which is a major, major theme in your work. And that leads us to that theme image, don't forget to pack a lunch. And I think basically fundamentally everything that you talk about throughout your practice, and particularly in this show, is seen in this really large scale work. And it's a really, really interesting composition. And it's about construction. And I would go as far as to say constructing identity, and then how that construction plays within a greater scheme of other constructs. So maybe we can talk about that. I see we have on the slide a part of this, everything is kind of extracted out of this image that we're going to get to. But this hard hat on top of a very high fade, if you will, the box cut, all of these things that we see deployed throughout this body of work have an origin within this large scale, almost monumental piece of work that's like a history painting, so to speak. So once we get to that slide, I think it'll be really great to talk about all of these different minions, all of these different almost clones of the self, and all of the nudity as well as the performance. Here we are with it there. That's what we're looking at now is the painting, Don't Forget to Pack a Lunch, which is also the name of the exhibition. So I'm going to leave you to unpack that a bit for us.
I think I always think in bodies of work, but I kind of like to consider one piece as central and everything else kind of originating and drawing from that central work. So this is that piece for me. I am because this is 80 by 106 inches. It's really, really big. But when you look at it at first, when you see it, it's too much to take in at once. There's so much happening. It kind of encourages, I think, a really thoughtful and purposeful viewership where you have to kind of move through these vignettes and see them all in relationship to each other, pull back, and kind of then you can start to take in the whole scene once you've taken in the smaller moments. But like you were saying, that the other large paintings in this room are all drawn pretty much directly from moments in this piece. So there's the planed figures up top in the marionette stringed planes. There's a funeral at the bottom right that's happening. The figures are wearing their hard hats as they work. And there's this sort of cyclical labor, this sort of cyclical construction and destruction of their environment. It's kind of like almost like an ant farm that we have again, we have total access to as the viewer, to the point of voyeurism. The tops of the buildings are chopped off. Everything that the figures are doing, we have complete access to. And yeah, for me, that's kind of the meat of my practice. As these figures go about these little futile duties, they're under our constant supervision, and their efforts are essentially in vain, because nothing is happening, nothing's changing, but they're just hard at work and ready to clock in and clock out and clock in over and over and over again.
Yes, and as true as that part is of this kind of homogenous, almost cloned, repeated behavior, you have actively put in moments of resistance.
Right.
That really, I think that's such a powerful thing, because you're making a really big statement of almost like we're doomed. This is how it is. We're a part of this hamster wheel. We are operating as robots for something that's bigger than us and something that has control over us. However, when you slow down that viewing process within the kind of topsy-turvy chaos of motion and in various scenes moving at once, you see these moments, these small vignettes of activism, of resistance, of really promoting change, even if it's just for the person's self. So it's this idea that, sure, there's this systemic thing happening, but there's this personal responsibility we all have to opt out to survive.
There are these moments in the work that I find to be some of my favorites, where the figures are kind of standing and just like staring at each other. Yeah. And I think a lot about, again, this duality of the self. And I like the idea that even though they are all the same figure, they play both the protagonist and the antagonist in different moments. And again, they are at odds with themselves and with each other. And again, I think that this adds context to the smaller works, and the smaller works add context to this piece, because I think even in the singular portraits, the figures play multiple roles. And for me, there's this idea of this kind of, each figure, although they're playing this one part, are part of this ecosystem, then at the same time are kind of pushing against the part that they have to play.
Even though I mentioned the Deposition in Burberry is one of my favorite works, I do think this is just such an incredible work to behold, especially in person, because it is a self-portrait. It's a composite self-portrait of yourself, split up into all of these different identities and movements, and the same identity, but just these different images and these different renderings of the self, these multiple avatars. And as we're looking at this one, where everyone's doing the same thing, and then the one in the middle is taking a cigarette break, and then you skip it, they're doing the same thing, and then the person towards the back is like, oh, I'm going to take a cigarette break too, and then the one way in the corner has also lit one up. And we don't know if that's a chain reaction of resistance or if that's just the status quo, everyone smokes, but it looks like it's probably not cool to smoke. You don't see anyone else doing that throughout any of this. No one else is taking a break. And the idea of smoking automatically refers to a break. It's self-indulgent. It's also an addiction. It's bad. It's a nasty habit. I hear people say, and they're indulging in it. And you don't get to see their eyes. So there's this little bit of irreverence, and I don't care. I'm going to smoke this. And then when I look at some of these other figures, I see so much of your own face as I look at you, and I'm getting to know you. And it's actually a very emotional piece, because as a viewer and then someone who's knowing you and someone who's closer to you, I really see the contemplation that these figures have, the decisions that one has to make. Do I opt in? I need this pay. I know I'm working past my physical capacity. I didn't sleep last night. I still have to show up. Is someone going to see me take too long of a break? And then there's this idea of I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I'm not, I'm going to get this money because I have to, but they don't own me. And all of these things. And then this idea of, do you see me? That's a big question. Like, does anyone just care?
Right.
And I think almost all of them. There's a slowing, when you really slow it down, you really see that then the facial expressions. I mean, there's bodies in the recycle bin. What does that say? What's your worth when we can just get someone to replace you, recycle your efforts really quickly? So it is a work scene to just kind of further unpack for those who are viewing it. There are various vignettes. There's a fire that's really not ablaze. It's a prop fire, and there's a hose with no water in it. There's a desk with really no paperwork. Those are blank receipts coming out of these accountant calculators. The other rooms are just people busy, just to be busy. This idea of this busy energy. And we've talked about hustling and grinding, and this idea that, especially our bodily label, I sleep when I die, I got to get this money. And that's something that we are indoctrinated in, and we kind of just get completely, brainwashed to believing. And we don't think sometimes about the mental health care and how every part of you as a human is very precious and very much of value, when this system only values that activity. How can you value yourself as an artist even when, I've heard collectors just say, oh, what's the biggest piece? I want that one. Or show me the one that has the most detail, seemingly the most detail. And you trouble that. So what the viewers aren't able to see is that the figures are roughed in sketches of graphite on pure canvas that have just a wash of color. And then everything else is truly painted, and nothing is modeled in that academic way like the rest of your other images are. There's this flatness, and it looks very simplistic, but it's highly complicated because this is something that conceptually had to be thought of and thought out. You thought about this much longer than you had to paint it. And I always tell even my mentees, my young painters who I speak and teach, I say, hey, paintings aren't painted, they're thought about. That's the difference between a crafter and a artist. And I just wonder how you as an artist think about these things with labor, and the idea of they can get rid of you tomorrow and somebody else would just fill your spot. But this is your expression. This is you.
Yeah, I mean, the generation point for this work was considering my relationship with labor and my sort of insistence on like sweat equity. And if I wasn't like breaking my back over it, then I wasn't doing anything. And so I start to think about performance or about labor as a performance of worth or a demonstration of value. And, I played basketball in undergrad, so I have this athletic background. And I think this transition over to art making kind of threw me, because I was so used to like sweating and knowing, and the sweat sort of telling me, okay, so I've been working.
Wow.
Right. Wow. And so like and then as a painter, there was this shift, and I was feeling this exhaustion. But I was kind of like kicking myself, like, why am I tired? Like, I'm not sweating. I'm not like, battling bodies on a court. Like, I'm not like actually physically exerting myself in the same way. And then I started to realize that the actual labor was so much more than just this like immediate muscular response. So yeah, and again, that was the central, what kind of started this idea of labor and these like workers, these laborers who are sort of toiling at something. And, you know, we talk about, are you being watched? And I think that kind of moves us into the figures throughout the work that are watching them. And again, they're like wearing this like bad camouflage, and
Right.
their feet are exposed. They have little eye holes cut out like a kid
Yeah.
dressed as a ghost on Halloween.
Yeah.
And, you know, because of the bad camouflage, my question has always been, how aware are these workers or are these performers that they're being watched? Or is the performance for themselves? Like, do they need to convince themselves that they're working hard? Or do they know that they're
And there's also this idea of being so used to being policed that you start to self-police and you surveillance the self. I mean, that's something that comes out of the colonial project of the New World, and this idea of just, you know, creating a desire of what the master narrative has and creating this aspiration to something you can never get to.
Right.
But listening to this idea that if you work hard enough, you can get it. And no one really tells you that the reason why this group has the power is because your labor engenders that power for them, and it makes you powerless. And if that was ever taught to you, the fear is you would stop working in that system, and then they would lose their power. I think that's a really strong point, because I think we get a little bit hung up with, when we think of racism and sexism and, you know, any type of ism, we think that it's really about the aesthetic of a thing. They hate my brown skin, they hate my tattoos, my hair, or the way I speak, and they just hate. No, it's a fear base that if we allow ourselves or allow you to have that access outside of the system that's built on you giving us this power, we will fall apart. And that fear makes us do atrocious, horrific things. And that's something to reckon with. It's not about, you know, everybody knows people of color are beautiful. You know, everyone knows the gifts and the worth, but it's a choice to disavow yourself from that investment in that. Because if I invest too much in you, I will really start to see your humanity, and then I can't complete my task of this system of power. What does that do? You know, so, you know.
No, I that's this idea of surveillance and self-surveillance. Again, is this the figures playing all those parts, like they're kind of watching themselves, kind of like they are the ones at their own backs, and you know, I think this is a nice little segue with this idea of like self-surveillance or like motivation. And there's this moment in the painting, I don't think we have like a close-up image of it, but there's this room in which there are just these little motivational posters kind of lining the wall as the figures are working. And you know, I'm really interested in these large paintings and like having these tiny little pastiches or these tiny little renderings where I can get in, because I do really love to like classically paint like high finish, high render things. So I want there to even be moments in these larger flat works to get in and kind of dig in.
But you're doing it in this tiny scale, which, going back to that statement of, I know so many collectors who say, oh, I want it bigger, or they want these very specific tactile applications to the artwork that has a theme associated with value, not truly value. And when I look at how tiny these detailed images, that there are these inspirational posters that, of course, blown up would be these fully realized masterpieces, but they look that way just there. And it's not like you had to reduce what you would do in the larger. In fact, you had to increase what you would do here to make it believable, to make us understand what it is. And that, first of all, the work there took place, again, in your mind, thinking that out. And then, of course, your highly developed hand, your draftsman skills, your painting, which, you know, I don't want to gloss over that. I want to talk about your actual technical and formal skills. And you probably would feel more comfortable with me talking about it in this praise praise type way, so I'll do it. That's fine.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's an amount of layering that creates like a luster to every surface. Even in these flat images, you can't help but it comes out a little bit. And I think the luster actually comes out in this idea of this is a stage.
Right.
So it's again this kind of play on it, like the shine, the spotlight is more about the concept. So even though little bit of that is seen, we feel it. I feel like I'm in the prop of the Wizard of Oz set. I feel like I'm in a Technicolor Hollywood setup. And I'm also feeling that I'm in this major workforced environment that is dependent on every little person to do what exactly, I don't know. So that question hangs. But, you know, we have these airplanes that are supported by strings. So you know there's a puppet master, but we don't see that puppet master. And this idea that the puppet master is everywhere is there. So all of that gets us to the things of, again, I have to go back to Renaissance art. I have to think of art of the Protestant Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. I think of Caravaggio. I think of lighting. I think of drama. And I think of how one deployed oil paint to create not only a three-dimensional, where with the Counter-Reformation, those are the ones, you know, the riches in the church, the windows, the gold chalices, the rope. It's a good thing. It's beautiful. And this is a part of who we are. And it's spiritual, this idea of imagery being so detailed and so just beautifully rendered, and this idea of the sumptuousness, inviting someone to almost want to touch the painting is something that's actually of holiness in a sense, because this represents the beauty of our maker and all of these things. So it was a counter argument, and you deal with that really well in your larger works and even your smaller portraiture, where goodness, I'm just enthralled with the amount of talent in the strokes of your painting. You don't see brush strokes, actually. It's completely smoothed out as if it's been graphically rendered, which is a really cool play, because I think graphic designers get a hard time in this contemporary art world, and people consider them not painters, just like photographers. I still don't think they get the place where a painter does. Even a sculpture, people would say a sculpture is what you move out of the way to see the painting. So here you are working with the painting, and you're getting rid of a lot of those painterly aspects, but you're rendering this highly glossy, like glossified, smoothed out, almost airbrushed image. And we know it's done with oil paint. And that too, and something that can only be done with paint.
I am absolutely in love with painting. And for me, I think there was a professor that I had at USF who would talk about when he was younger. He grew up lower class, and he would see things like furniture, like amazing things they could never afford, so he would make them. You could like steal it. It's like you can take something. And for me, when I looked at these images, you know, growing up, when I saw paint, I want to constantly be chasing this highest level of painting, which of course is unattainable, and which I think is a good thing. It's like chasing this dangling carrot that you'll never reach. But I also really appreciate the fact that in the larger works, it's freeing to have these flat areas of color, and then play with repetition and play with pattern and balance, and in a different way than the classically handled large works. But again, I think that if these large works were handled in the same way, I don't think it would work the same. I don't think it would be as impactful, because like you said, these figures are just the underdrawings with my ground laid on top, and to the point at the end, only the architectural, like the forms that are cut in half of the architecture and the figures remain as that wash, as that underpainting. And so the rest of the work is kind of built up around the figures and around the architectural lines, which I think is, for me, important. Figures kind of function as both foundation and like alien to the rest of the painting. And so I don't know, that's when I'm considering these larger works, which are a break from the way that I paint in my smaller works and in the smaller scale, larger works.
That's so important, and it's actually incredibly refreshing and innovative. And it's also incredibly refreshing that you can so eloquently talk about, really explain to us what you're doing. And again, as an art historian, I understand the dialogue within these works and art of the past, and also where the future works can go. So at this time, I think it's a great time to open up the floor for some question and answers. And yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so we do have a few questions. The first one, question for Jake. One thing people say is that they sense a Roger Brown quality to how you approach the composition of your work. Is he an influence for you, or what are you thinking about specifically?
No, I wouldn't say Roger Brown is an influence for me. I'm not really even sure right now if I could tell you who Roger Brown is. I don't know, maybe I'm just, but I guess when I think of influences, my my earliest, like the way that I was like looking at imagery, I looked at a lot of Mad Magazine. I looked at a lot of like R. Crumb. It was just really, I was reading like Far Side, Calvin and Hobbes. So a lot of that was actually like sequential art, and super narrative, and I think smartly kind of navigating subject matter that was, again, different from the way that the art itself was handled. So there was this kind of play between subject matter and the immediacy of the visual. And then later, as I started to really, like when I got into grad school, actually, it was when I started looking at contemporary art. And I started looking at a lot of like, I looked at some like the Chicago Imagists. I looked at a lot of like John Curran and obviously Kerry James Marshall and Faith Ringgold. And that was kind of, and realistically speaking, I graduated last May of 2019. And in grad school was when I started looking at contemporary art. I say this a lot, and I'm really open about it. My contemporary art background was not formed until roughly 4 years ago. That's when I started really looking at things outside of like this idea of low art, right? With like the comic and like art crumb and underground stuff like that.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Second question, when you finish a painting, do you ever discover connections to your ideas or personal experiences you didn't realize you were thinking while working on the piece? Any particular examples in the show?
When I finish a painting, do I find connections? I'm pretty regimented about this. I have my works planned out before I even put paint to canvas. I'm an avid drawer, so I'm drawing all the time, and I work my drawings until I know what the paintings are going to be. But what I think does happen is the work can kind of be further contextualized by like the moment. For instance, I was finishing this work and almost done with all of these paintings because I bring everything up all at once. I bring everything to completion all at once. And as I was in the last like maybe week of the demonstration, the piece of me in the casket was when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered, and it kind of, it was just a crazy time and super exhausting to be looking at this work through this lens of the moment. But what it reminds me of, and what it reminded me of at that point was, I wasn't making this work in response to that time. It was more that the theme is just a transcendent, overarching truth. And so I don't know. I guess that's a really interesting moment for me, is to see the work be contextualized by the moment. In a way that is really important, because I want to make work that's not just in response to a time, but more so the time can kind of orbit the work. That makes sense.
That makes sense. That's actually really fascinating to hear that, and to think about the reverse of that and what that might look or feel like. Yeah. One more question so far. This is the last question that's been posted. So if anybody else has questions, please feel free. Can you talk about how you arrived at utilizing the actual underpainting to render skin tone in the large multi-figure work?
Yeah. So I actually underpaint all of my work. You know, I have a very classical approach to making a painting, and so I always have this underpainting on my pieces. But with the large scale work, when I was making the first one of these, I was looking at the figures as I was bringing everything up around them, and I started to really love the way the ground is this strange non-human color. So it kind of is like this weird orange, but it's still like an orange brown. And I was also really, really fascinated with how the figures, I mean, if you'll have to see there's some details, but moments where the figures are kind of interacting with these architectural lines, they're kind of like generated from them. So it like looks like they're rising out of them or like sinking into them. And then when it also really forces you to get into the piece to see the pencil lines and to see their little mustaches and noses and pointed eyebrows. So yeah, it was really, I think it was actually really natural. But then as I let it, I had to push against my inclination to bring everything up highly classically and highly rendered. And then it you know, in hindsight, it was one of those moments where I was like, okay, this is definitely the right move. I don't need to finish everything the way that I've finished my paintings in the past. And it allows the figures to kind of, I don't know, it's almost like they vibrate between the scene and just like the underneath, which I think is interesting.
Definitely, thank you. Those are all the questions that have been posted. So I think we can wrap it up, but thank you so much, Danny and Jake. What an amazing show. Congratulations. It's really great. And I feel like I really got to see it, and I'm not there, but I'm glad that I got this walkthrough. And so yeah, thanks for everyone who's listening in, and thanks everyone for joining us. Huge thank you to Jake, Danny, Monique, and everyone at the gallery for making the conversation happen. Please go to chicagogalleryopen.org and see all of the amazing work presented by Chicago galleries, nonprofits, and artist-run spaces that are on view right now. And be sure to view the program and join us for more artist conversations and walkthroughs over this week and over the weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.